and this is part 2 of the series on doing searches with FileMaker Pro. So we talked a little bit about found sets in the previous one and some basic searches on doing something like all the records, for example, like in Portland. And we took a look at the operators menu and did some pretty basic searches with a lot of the things in here. So where's the next part of this? Like, what are some of the other things that you can do? And let's talk a little bit about relational search. So on this particular layout, all the records that we're searching on are actually just in the company table. But if I click on one of these, I can see that I've got data in 2 other tables. If I flip through some records, some of these tables might have more than one contact, some of them have more than one invoice. So for example, if I want to find all of the records, all of the company records that have an invoice for a Telecaster, I can just go to Find Mode and then put Telecaster in any of the line. Really, when you're in Find Mode, only the first line of a portal will show up. And this will find all of the records that have a Telecaster in either the first or any line from the related data. You can also do combined searches for this. So for example, if you only want to find somebody whose name starts with E who bought a Telecaster, that would be refine. So that's the command we learned in the previous one, Command R, Control R on Windows, which keeps the word Telecaster in here. And then I can go up to the first name and just put an E, and this will find only people whose name starts with E who have bought a Telecaster. And there it goes. It's only 12 records on my list. You can further nail that down and say I only want to find ones that are in like Washington, D.C. That have a name that starts with E that bought a Telecaster. So you're really getting this down. That's actually only one record. So those are pretty interesting. So another interesting thing with the search that you can do on this is actually omit search requests. So when you're in search mode, take a look up here in this menu. You get a different menu bar. New request we looked at a little bit in the first video. That's where you can search for things that don't overlap. So for example, everybody in Oregon and a new request, everybody in Washington. If I do that search and then look at my list, I'll get everybody in either of those 2 states, which is pretty cool. But another way that you could do this is you could do a second request of everybody. So the first request will say like everybody that's in Oregon. And then the second request we'll do an omit. So this is something that's interesting. And we'll omit all the ones that are in Portland. So I'll find everybody in Oregon, but I don't want to see anybody that's in Portland, Oregon. And if I do this search, I'll get only cities that are not Portland, which is pretty interesting. Here's what's weird about this and what's useful to know. If I did that same search, but I did it in the other order, in other words, on the first record, I say I want to omit Portland and click omit on that one. And that I did a new request, which is not an omit, for Oregon, you would think that you would get the same result, but you don't. So it's interesting because look, we've got 20,000 results. We've got a whole bunch of records here that are not in Oregon at all, and some that are in Portland. So the omit request, I'm not sure exactly why it is, but I'll tell you, it must be the second request. It can't be the first one. It's also good to note that you can actually have multiple omit requests. So you can say, I want Oregon, but I don't want Portland. Omit that one. I don't want Bend, and I don't want Eugene, right? So I can omit Bend, Portland, and Eugene. And so I've got basically one, I call these positive requests for an include request, and then 3 negative requests to omit. And then that gives me my list of only the other cities that are not those 4. So I talked a little bit about refine being useful. This is where you're really going to see how useful it is, because if I hit refine, I'll actually see modify last find. I'll see exactly what I previously searched for, and this is a really good way to kind of keep sculpting it. So if you're doing some sort of a large accounting report, I find this to be a really useful feature. So that's it for part 2 of this series. We'll get back to even more advanced features in part 3.